Welcome. My name is Susan Talbert. I'm the Interim Director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And welcome. I can't recall, I think we inaugurated this lecture in 2005, so this would be the 12th Ann L. Harper Annual Lecture. My job today is really to be sort of just welcome you, introduce you to the lecture, and then I'm introducing the introducer, and Megan Sinnott will introduce our speaker. Tiffany King has instructed me to turn your attention to this sign. What will you do with it?
You have a Twitter account.
She wants live tweeting. Will you guys live tweet?
Tweet people.
Just say yes. Anyway, let me introduce our lecture to you, which is the Ann L. Harper Lecture was founded really at the beginning of the founding of what was at the time the Women's Studies Institute. Our founding director, Diane Folks, was good friends with Ann Harper, who is a local activist. She founded the lecture with what she called a desire to provoke conversation, study, and debate, and wanted this very much to be a meeting place between the academy and activists and just folks in the general public. Ann has had a long relationships in the Atlanta Board of Education, working with cool girls, and has recently, or over the past years, formed her own nonprofit consulting company. And our goal today is to continue to honor the legacy that she's offered us. The privilege of having an endowed lecture and being able to bring some of the finest scholars from around the country for us to talk to is really a wonderful, wonderful luxury. So we're really honored. I talked with Ann yesterday, and she was sorry not to be here. Well, I think she's glad to be where she is, which is enjoying a little bit of retirement time in Massachusetts. But she wanted me to send her greetings, tell you that she would join us next year, and to tell Deborah that she loves your title and likes radical coalitions. So with that, I'll end, and Megan Sinnott will be introducing Deborah Gould.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is really exciting. I'm so happy to have Debbie Gould here with us today. This is sort of a dream. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me? Does this work? Okay. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Dr. Gould is an associate professor in the sociology department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is also an affiliated faculty member of the Feminist Studies Department, History of Consciousness Department, which is very cool, and the Politics Department. Her first book, Moving Politics, Emotion and ACT UP's Fight Against AIDS, from the University of Chicago Press, has been widely acclaimed. Some of the honors include the Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association Political Sociology section in 2010, and the Ruth Benedict Prize from the American Anthropological Association. And she was also a finalist, this book was also a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBT Studies. Her second book in progress is titled Emotional Terrains of Activism, Appetites, Encounters, and the Not Yet of Politics. And today she's going to give a talk on becoming coalitional, the perverse encounters of queer to the left and the Jesus People USA. But first I just wanted to say a little bit about how I encountered Dr. Gould's work. When I was in graduate school, I had a very super Marxist advisor and professor for many seminars, and she indoctrinated us very well, and she taught us that the left is rational, the right is emotional, and that made perfect sense. I mean, those crazies, we're reading Marx, and they're off, nationalism and these right-wing projects. As I have grown through the years, I've been less satisfied with that accounting of emotion and politics. My own political feelings and my own research on activist politics found passion, despair, elation, rage, love, all these things were in all of our political moments and all of our activities. So I turned to affect theory, thinking this would give me some help, reading Sylvan Tompkins, Brian Masumi, Sarah Ahmed, and it's just a huge cacophony, and it's a mess. And I had a wonderful breakfast with Martin Manuel Anson at some, I think, affecty themed conference. I'm like, I just don't know what to do with all this. And he said, well, what you gotta do is get Deborah Gould's Moving Politics, little paperback, and read her introduction, and you'll have a way in. And I did, and it worked. And there is this one quote she has that I just love, and I think it's probably one of the most widely quoted phrases you'll see in articles on affect. She says, affect indicates the non-conscious and unnamed, but nevertheless registered, experiences of bodily energy and intensity that arise in response to stimuli impinging on the body. And you will see this in many, many works citing her, because it is so succinct, and there's no way I could ever put it in better words, so why not just use her words? So with no further ado, let me introduce Debbie Gould.
So it's lovely to be here. I'm really honored to be doing this Ann Harper lecture, and I want to thank Tiffany and Susan and Megan and Andy for getting the logistics, the whole women's, genders, sexuality studies crew that invited me and kind of facilitated everything. So thank you very much. And I thought that I would begin with a brief overview of some of my work, the kinds of my senses of urgency, my particular kind of intellectual interests and inclinations, kind of what I'm obsessed with, as a way in, and then go into my talk. And I would say that in the broadest sense, my interest is in social change and social reproduction, and why and how the social world changes, and when it does, and why and how it sometimes stays the same. And because history shows that people, through their collective efforts, our collective efforts, are a key factor in making social change, my work tends to focus on the sources of collective political action and inaction. And within those broad contours, I'm interested in questions about political imaginaries and their conditions of possibility. You need me to be louder? Yes. Is it possible to turn this on?
No, do we know anything about, does anybody know anything about how it works?
Let's see. Do I have to turn on? Maybe it's for this. Oh yeah.
The mic is in there. You go, yeah.
Lectern mic, let's see.
There you go.
Okay. Great.
That's a little too bad.
Thank you so much. Okay, how's that? Great, okay. And there's not even really any feedback. Just wave again if my voice drops, so just let me know. Okay, so, and within those broad contours of this interest in social change and social reproduction, I'm interested in questions about political imaginaries and their conditions of possibility. So how do people come to their understandings of the world and their sense of what else might be possible, how to get there? What are the factors that make political action conceivable at all, or that make some forms of activism conceivable while others remain completely unimaginable? How are attitudes about what is politically possible or desirable in a given moment, how do they come into being and take hold, and why do they sometimes change? This question about political imaginaries is also an inquiry into activism as world building. I'm curious about how we imagine alternative worlds, alternative futures, and then try to bring those into being. Central in my work is what I call political emotion, a phrase that draws attention to the visceral, bodily, felt dimensions of politics. all too frequently, and I think Megan was kind of suggesting this, all too frequently politics is understood through the lens of rational self-interest, where you have preformed discrete groupings, each at bottom rationally pursuing its own self-interest. And that's typically the way politics is understood. And I use the phrase political emotion to try to unsettle that rational actor model, which tends to equate emotionality with irrationality. And I want to also unsettle the problematic but still quite pervasive classical liberal division of the world into the public and the private spheres, where politics is relegated to, is understood to take place in the public sphere. It's understood to be rational. That's where rational deliberation takes place. And feelings are relegated and confined, really, to the public sphere and I'm sorry, to the private sphere, hidden away as something that interferes with reason. My work begins from the premise that feelings are fundamental to political life, not in the sense that they overtake reason and thereby interfere with deliberative processes, as they often are disparagingly construed, but rather in the sense that there's an affective dimension to all of the processes and practices that make up the political, broadly defined. The political, after all, is a realm of conflict, desire, pushes and pulls. Political matters move us. My work tries to carve out some conceptual space that allows us to better explore the sensed, the visceral, the non-rational as opposed to irrational, which I can return to. So the kind of less than fully conscious, inchoate, frequently contradictory dimensions of political motivation and behavior. Now, of course, there was lots of talk about emotion in this last election and everything that has occurred subsequently, and I have some thoughts about that. I'd be happy to think with you all more about that in the Q&A if you want to. But how to understand feelings. Rather than understanding emotions as natural, ready-made substances that reside inside individual persons and have fixed, determinate properties, I see them as materializing through sociality, by which I mean they come to have determinate properties and thus a nature, as well as import and effects through contact, through encounter, relation, entanglement, through being, doing, and becoming with together. Now, that's not to say that the matter of emotions doesn't matter, but simply that their matter is neither given nor fixed, but rather takes shape and has import through relation. In that sense, bodily feeling is potentiality that materializes through sociality, through contact. In addition to exploring their contours and textures, I explore the sources of feelings, how they can be widely shared in a given context, their cultural and historical specificity and variability, and their social uses, particularly how power is exercised through and reproduced in our feelings. So with that as kind of a brief, description of what some of my interests are, I want to start my talk and can return to some of that more conceptual stuff as we go. So again, the talk is Becoming Coalitional, the Perverse Encounter of Queer to the Left and the Jesus People USA. Okay, so in the late 1990s, there was a low-cost housing coalition that formed in the uptown neighborhood of Chicago. And it formed under the auspices of an activist group called Community of Uptown Residents for Affordability and Justice, Courage. And the coalition lasted until about 2005. And although it had some victories, it was not especially successful, at least not in the usual quantifiable sense. It did not, for example, make much of a dent in the gentrification processes in Chicago. Indeed, the coalition might be deemed largely inconsequential. And so I'm interested in this past moment in activism, not because it had tremendous effects, but because it still might. Marxist theorist Ernst Bloch argues that the not yet of the past is neither fully past, nor does its non-actualization make it unreal. The not yet exists in the present as potentiality. The unrealized potentialities of the past, what we might call the not yet of politics, provides a storehouse of live possibilities for the now. My curiosity is in what a coalition can do. Abstracting from the specifics of any actual coalition, I want to explore more generally what touch across difference, that's Donna Haraway's phrase, what touch across difference makes possible, what desires, capacities, and potentialities a coalition might generate and nourish. Now, given everything that we, in the most capacious sense of we, both human and non-human organisms, so given everything that we're facing, from climate change to vast poverty and growing inequalities to ongoing white supremacy and male supremacy, and of course we faced all of that long before this last election, even if today we face all of that in their kind of present historical specificity. But in any event, if facing these immense challenges requires divergent groups to join together, an exploration of what you will see as a rather strange alliance might entice us to try. So I'm going to begin with a different coalition to provide some prehistory. Many of you will probably recall in the late 1980s, or maybe you've read about or learned about, but in the late 1980s in the United States, the Christian right group Operation Rescue, which began a campaign to shut down medical clinics where women could get abortions. They also do many other things, but they were places where women could go to get abortions. And Operation Rescue, the participants would sit down in front of the clinics and pray often, and they would try to block access to women who were trying to go into the clinics. And many of the Operation Rescue protesters in Chicago, it turns out, came from a group called the Jesus People USA, which is an intentional Christian community founded in the early 1970s and based in Chicago's uptown neighborhood. And they're evangelicals, and as evangelicals they have a mission of emulating Jesus. One of their main activities is providing meals to people who don't have homes, don't have houses. And they also oppose abortion. And in the late 1980s, they joined in this coalition with Operation Rescue to shut down women's health clinics that provided abortions. And in response, pro-choice activists held what were called clinic defenses. I think that some of this is still going on. It kind of died down for a while. It's probably going to come back. But pro-choice activists would hold clinic defenses where they would escort women into the clinics through the crowd of people who were usually kneeling and praying, trying to shut the clinic down. And the encounter at these clinics was often quite confrontational. It was sort of like enemies facing off against one another. Okay, so that was the late 80s, early 90s. Now fast forward to the late 90s when Courage's low-cost housing coalition formed. And gentrification had really taken hold in Chicago and in the uptown neighborhood by this point in time, and rising rents were forcing long-term residents out of the neighborhood. Battle lines pit relative newcomers who were largely white and middle class against long-term residents who were disproportionately poor and black and brown, although the neighborhood had also been a port of entry for poor whites who were migrating from Appalachia, who had worked in the coal mines. They were migrating to Chicago. So Uptown was a port of entry for many immigrants, including, and migrants, in this case, many poor whites as well. Visible among the newcomers were middle-class white gay men. And by visible, I mean that they read to others as gay, even if they didn't announce themselves as such, but also that they were visible as newcomers who wanted to, quote unquote, clean up the neighborhood. Now, and parenthetically, and I think this is important, I just want to note that the idea that gay men are central to gentrification, that idea has very long roots. And I think it is rather misleading insofar as it understands the problem of gentrification at the individual level rather than recognizing the structural causes of urban development, displacement, and gentrification. But in any event, in this case, there were a number of gay men who were visibly on the side of gentrification. By that, I mean they were going to neighborhood meetings, they were asking the police to sweep the people without homes off the streets, they were opposing the construction of low-cost housing in the neighborhood. Perhaps less expected were the gay, or better, queer forces on the other side, fighting against gentrification and for low-cost housing. And that was a group called Queer to the Left. Drawing from the gay liberation tradition, as well as from ACT UP's anti-normative queer politic, Queer to the Left formed in the late 1990s as a cross-class, multiracial group of lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer people fighting for racial, economic, sexual, and gender justice. Initially forming to take on the growing conservatism of the more establishment-oriented gay movement, Queer to the Left focused a lot of its work on the fight for low-cost housing. So Queer to the Left joined the Courage coalition, as did the Jesus People USA, which meant that Queer to the Left was working shoulder to shoulder with the Jesus People, many of whose members, along with opposing abortion, also had a position against homosexuality, deeming homosexuals to be sinners. So in this talk, I hope to illuminate why these two groups participated in this coalition together. But again, my interest is in the more theoretical question about what a coalition can do. That question draws inspiration from Deleuze, who, in his interpretation of Spinoza, observes that we do not yet know what a body can do. Following Spinoza, Deleuze defines a body by its power to affect and to be affected. That is to say, by what it can do in the face of an encounter with another body or bodies. And because we can't know in advance what encounters will occur, or what capacities will thereby be unleashed, I understand encounter itself as a realm of experiment and of possibilities not yet actualized, a realm of potential. A coalition is an encounter, a gathering together of bodies and their temporary being in relation with one another. And just as we don't know what a body can do, neither do we know what a coalition of bodies can do, what capacities and potentialities such an encounter might support, feed, generate. And that's what I want to consider in this talk. Okay, so I initially turned my attention to this coalition because although I participated in it, in retrospect it seems strange. I was a member of Queer to the Left, and here we were, self-identified queer leftists, participating in a fight for low-cost housing with evangelical Christians who opposed homosexuality. Now, coalitions often contain groups with quite divergent views, but this was rather extreme. And most striking here is that difference was both pronounced and a non-event. Queer to the Left and the Jesus People USA never even broached the topic of homosexuality. So how then to make sense of this sort of coalition which displays affinities and reciprocities across chasms of perceived difference? All coalitions are about aligning with different others. And if you think about the Black feminist musician, scholar Bernice Johnson Reagan, she famously noted this when she contrasted coalition work to home. And described the former, coalition work, as, quote, some of the most dangerous work you can do. The question then is how to make sense of any coalition. Now, social movement scholars who explore coalitions usually begin conceptually with discrete groups, each with its given interests and values, and then you start there, and then presuming that groups join coalitions for pragmatic, instrumental reasons, they then focus on factors that either facilitate or that somehow facilitate coalescing, some coalition coming together. So for example, shared threats or shared opportunities or a shared ideology or identity or something along those lines. And that approach certainly illuminates aspects of some of the reasons why Queer to the Left and the Jesus People joined this coalition. Both groups had a social justice orientation that led them to support low-cost housing, and they may have believed that by joining with others, they would that would help them to secure their goal of more low-cost housing. But so much is occluded by that sort of rationalist hypothesis, which suspects self-interested pragmatism always and only as the motivation behind coalescing with others. What about motivations that may be non-instrumental, even less than fully conscious? And beyond that question of motivation, there are other questions to pursue, such as what occurs when different groups get into the room together, what a coalition might do beyond pursue its stated aims. That is, what the very event of such coalescing might do in the sense of what it might allow to happen. Scholars and activists who think about coalitions from the perspective of identity politics emphasize the difficulties of working across difference. Again, Bernice Regan declared, you don't get a lot of food in a coalition. And without denying the difficulties to which she refers, for example, the ways in which those within a coalition might feel hungry for a redress of the power imbalances or hungry for recognition as examples, without denying those wants and needs, this case asks us to consider additional political appetites and the pull that such desires might exert. So when I began this project, I was stumped about why we in Queer to the Left didn't care that we were in a coalition with a group that opposed homosexuality. The Jesus people's homophobia, as I suggested earlier, just wasn't an issue. And retrospectively, no one, including me, could say why. So my method is, in a sense, and this is drawn from Lawrence Grossberg, looking for the virtual inside of the actual, looking for the affective, what we perhaps could not have articulated at the time, but was in play, exerting force, allowing this unlikely alliance to exist. So I plumb this instance of what philosopher Isabel Stengers would call convergence without unity, in the hopes of learning more about what a coalition can do, as well as about political appetite and the not yet of politics. So my research suggests that in addition to a political commitment to the fight for low-cost housing, what drove this alliance were political desires that challenge the supposition that coalitions are mainly tactical, pragmatic affairs. The encounter itself compelled. When I interviewed the Jesus People's point person in the coalition, and his name is John Trott, he described the coalition as glorious. He acknowledged, in his words, the deep points of division between the Jesus People and Queer to the Left, but in the same breath, he described the thrill of this encounter, calling this coalition of queers and Jesus freaks, that's his language, the coolest thing ever, something that he ventured put a smile on God's face. Okay, now I don't know about God's smile, but it may be that there's something enticing about strange and unexpected encounters in the contact zones of coalitions. As housing activists, we were all fighting for Uptown to remain a vibrant, multiracial neighborhood, affordable to poor and working class people, a space for chance encounters across race, class, and other lines of difference. The coalition itself created precisely that sort of contact zone. And my sense is that members of Queer to the Left and the Jesus People participated in part because we were seeking, if perhaps non-consciously, to, in anthropologist Katie Stewart's words, be in something together, be in something with others. Coalitions allow you to be in it with, to try out being and doing together. They offer collectivity, an opportunity to get your toes wet, get your hands a little dirty, doing something with others who are in it with you. Accompanying and being accompanied by in your political doings can be pleasurable in itself, providing sustenance in a world that more typically produces separation and isolation. Getting into a room together with previously unknown others also can create a sense of possibility where one previously did not exist. That is, breaking out of a known milieu, the kind of breaking out of the same old, which perhaps feels kind of defeated or maybe exhausted in its ongoing sameness. Breaking out of that can challenge a relation to time that understands the future as determined by the past, generating instead a sense that through being and doing together, something unanticipated might occur. I think many of us are all too familiar with the genre of the activist meeting where you get into the room and you know what everyone is going to say, including yourself, prior to anyone opening their mouths. And encounters across lines of difference hold the possibility that something that has not been here before might come into being. And of course, surprises occur amid the same old, too. But getting into a room together with unknown others multiplies the sense, and I think the likelihood, that something out of the ordinary might happen. Together in the room, say, of Tahrir Square, where days into the movement, just days into the movement that overthrew Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Christians formed a protective cordon around Muslims during Friday prayers, and Muslims likewise protected Christians during Sunday Mass. Regardless of post-revolutionary conflicts, which have been immense, but regardless of that, their solidarity during the first period of the revolution, a solidarity which seemed historic, and itself an incitement to others to join in, and others then did join in, I think was really critical in overthrowing the dictator, Mubarak, 30-year dictator. So whether the borders crossed are religious, national, sexual, or otherwise, activists enlarge the political horizon when they show that socially produced differences can be produced differently. Coalescing across difference, thinking with others with whom you disagree, widens the space in which new ideas can emerge and be tried on for size, experiments can be undertaken, feelings can alter, and possibilities for bringing other worlds into being can grow. Because the outcome of being in something with others is unpredetermined and unpredictable and out of anyone's sole control, coalition can cultivate openness to the unknown and nourish the capacity to be surprised, to think and feel in a manner that, drawing again from Bloch, ventures beyond and toward the not yet. I'd venture that a more open disposition to the unknown gives collective world-building efforts a better chance of taking off and taking hold. Related, being with unfamiliar others with no guarantee about what will result from that coming together can feed a desire and a capacity to be changed, to learn and become different than you once were. Now, importantly here, both the Jesus people and Queer to the Left had that orientation toward change. The Jesus people growing out of the early 70s hippie counterculture, and Queer to the Left drawing from gay liberation ideas that developed in the same time period. So both had this orientation towards that sort of self-change and social change. Someone that I interviewed from the Jesus people marveled at what he called the, quote, weird reality that an encounter across difference can produce. He said, when someone becomes your friend, their issues begin to become your issues. And he continued, you begin to see things in a way you didn't see them before. There's seats up in the front if people want to come up. Yeah, come on up. Similarly, a Queer to the Left member recalled an event in a church when he realized that participating in low-cost housing activism required that he change. Religion, he noted, had been part of the problem when he was an AIDS activist. And so he's referring there to the Catholic Church's opposition to safe-sex education, opposition to condoms, and so on. So religion had been part of the problem. But getting involved in neighborhood politics against gentrification meant working with religious people. And so he continued, we were now part of a coalition with all kinds of religious people, the Jesus people and the Catholics and the Lutherans. And that made him realize that we were going to have a different relationship to religion. Still somewhat astonished by having been able to make that shift, he marveled, we're a group called Queer to the Left, and we're going to work with the Lutheran Church of the Savior and the Catholic Church of the Virgin? And then he concluded, and these are going to be our people. So these are going to be our people. He was opening himself to aligning with, in a sense, becoming family with, people whom he very recently had opposed in the political arena. This encounter across what had seemed a chasm of difference challenged him to change. Echoing philosopher and activist Grace Lee Boggs, her notion of a two-sided transformation of ourselves and our institutions, and also echoing theorist Kathy Weeks' argument that a willingness to become otherwise is necessary in any remaking of the world. He linked the sort of self-transformation that he experienced in the coalition to the process of social transformation, saying, quote, if you want to create change, that is, if you want to move away from just doing critique and do the work of actually building something, it's necessary to work with people who are not like you, who are not already lined up with you. Another Queer to the Left member noted that there's only so much work you can do on yourself, arguing that interactions across lines of difference are necessary for learning, growing, and changing to occur. Both of these activists suggested that being in relation to and touched by others' differences is necessary for self and social transformation. Gayatri Gopinath suggests such a model of non-blood-based affiliation rooted in and through difference is queer, and notes that such moments of affective relationality across difference open the door to new ways of conceptualizing the self and others. A member of the Jesus People likewise suggested the queerness of that pull toward difference. There's something almost perverse, he said, in a good way, that makes you want to get closer. And then echoing him, a Queer to the Left member was similarly motivated by this politics of connection across difference. She said, quote, we perversely wanted to incorporate the homophobic, to be next to it, in the midst of it, to be in it, in an ongoing process with everybody. The extremity, even the exoticism of this difference was part of the draw. She cared about being in the battle for low-cost housing, but the coalition compelled her in its non-instrumental dimensions as well. An inexplicable coming together, an ongoing engagement that provided something beyond the explicit goals of the coalition. So this was not simply a pragmatic affair. I think it can feel quite euphoric to defy capitalism's logic of divide and rule, to not accede to the pitting of identity against identity, but instead to upend that logic and try other ways of relating. Perhaps we were attracted by the excitement of who we might become and who they might become through this touching and being touched by the pleasure of composing a new collectivity and the anticipation of what might then happen. This mode of politics, which seeks encounter and the potentialities and capacities that flow from encounter, may characterize identity politics more than critics allow. Given the difficulties of living, and I'm saying that because, you know, the difficulties of living in a heteronormative, gender-normative world, many people in Queer to the Left identified as queer in the LGBT sense of that term. So we found belonging in that queer identity. But we weren't reducible to that identity or to an inclusion-seeking form of identity politics that might be expected to flow from that identity. Queer to the Left's identity politics instead aimed to elaborate and enact a left politic that attuned to the complexity of oppression, to the ways that class, for example, is lived through race, sexuality, and gender, and vice versa, what we call intersectionality. In a context where middle-class gay white men in the neighborhood had aligned themselves with gentrification, Queer to the Left participants wanted to live belonging differently, not primarily through identity, but through politics, through doing together and being in it with one another and with others fighting for social transformation. So coalition certainly forces encounter, as Bernice Regan reminds, when distinguishing between home and the more dangerous work in coalition where you don't much get fed, as she says. But it allows encounter as well, offering nourishment, although of a sort that feeds other political appetites. The Courage Coalition fed Queer to the Left's desire to engage in activism that differed from what the more establishment-oriented gay movement offered. And by the late 90s, the fight for gay marriage had really colonized the gay movement. Queer to the Left really lamented that reduction of gay politics to an identity-based claim for rights, for admission into the status quo. We were hungry for something else, and it couldn't be returning to traditional leftist politics either, where gayness tends to be seen as a mere lifestyle, heteronormativity is relegated to a secondary issue, and bodies and pleasures are deemed non-political. The Courage Coalition allowed a different politic to emerge, one that drew connections between economic precarity and queer worlds. It provided Queer to the Left a space to join with others in the struggle for low-cost housing, to build trust with others in the coalition in a manner that allowed us to inject an analysis of homophobia into the broader discussion about the workings of gentrification. And it also allowed us to fight for the promises and possibilities that public street life and varied neighborhoods hold, and that life under racial capitalism largely disallows. So, for example, chance meetings and mixings of different worlds, unanticipated interactions, and intimacies, what science fiction writer and social theorist Samuel Delaney describes as interclass contact. As one Queer to the Left member reminded me, that politic and its desires aligned well with what coalition itself provides, a context for people to live belonging differently through politics and doing together beyond fixed identity. Now, just as the coalition was a space from which Queer to the Left challenged narrow renderings of gay identity and politics, this unlikely coalescing also allowed the Jesus people to perform evangelical identity and politics differently. Arguing that the Christian faith had been hijacked by fascists and that the devil was doing his best work in this nation right now through the Christian right, John Trott from the Jesus People told me that those who participated in the coalition from the Jesus People found belonging more through this coalition than evangelical identity. Quote, he said, the reality was we felt way more at home with Queer to the Left than we did with a lot of our evangelical friends. So with the gay mainstream pursuing respectability and constructing Queer to the Left as extremists, we too felt marginal in our own community and more at home in a coalition that placed no strictures on our left politics or our queerness, even if the Jesus People believed that homosexual sex was prescribed by Scripture. So this encounter between stigmatized Jesus freaks and non-normative leftist queers offers an example of what political scientist Kathy Cohen describes as the radical potential of movement building rooted in a shared marginal relationship to dominant power. So what happens in the contact zones of coalition? What does being with do? Post-colonial and science studies scholars deploy the concept of contact to remind us that entities come into being relationally through entanglement. So I want to just take a little tangent into an interpretation from the philosopher Vincent Desprez, a science studies philosopher, about the story of clever Hans, who was a horse who lived in Berlin in the early part of the 20th century, and it seemed like he was able to do math. Has anyone heard of clever Hans? Okay, a few people have. When given math problems, Hans tapped out the correct answers with his hoof. And so people were perplexed, and they called in a veterinarian and a director of an institute of psychology and a math teacher and a retired army officer to watch Hans solve math problems and try to figure out how he did it. And it turned out that humans unintentionally and involuntarily made barely perceptible bodily movements that signaled to Hans when to begin tapping and when to stop. So after giving Hans the problem, the math problem, and in anticipation of him beginning to tap out the answer, the questioners unwittingly made a slight forward-leaning motion with their heads and bodies, and Hans began to tap. And when Hans reached the correct answer, the humans released tension from their bodies and made a slight upward jerk with their head and bodies, and Hans stopped tapping. So Hans was able to answer their questions correctly because, as Dupre puts it, he had attuned to and thereby learned how to read human bodies. Rather than an ability to do math, his genius was learning how to relate to these other beings. Hans had become human sensitive. And even more, Hans had taught the humans, without their knowledge, the right gestures to involuntarily perform. He had made his humans unwittingly become horse sensitive. And both were altered by being together. Hans was becoming horse with human, and the humans human with horse. So this relational becoming is about affecting and being affected by through encounter, through ongoing being together and becoming differently as a result. As with Hans and his humans, we were becoming in that relational manner. We were becoming Queer to the Left with the Jesus People USA, and they were becoming the Jesus People USA with Queer to the Left. Through our encounter, we constituted one another differently. Where before, Queer to the Left had been a queer group that mostly related to the gay rights movement and had no formal relation to any religious group, it now was something else. It was still queer, it was still left, but differently so. And that was true as well for the Jesus People, who now were a Christian group in relation to a queer group. We were no longer direct opposites if we ever had been. Being in the room together encouraged each group to shed stereotypes about one another and to particularize its own universalizing cosmology. One Jesus People member noted that there is always pain when you are close to difference, but he stressed that the good outweighs the suffering. He continued, "That's what relationships with Queer to the Left and other people teach me. The suffering means you're having to stretch, and nobody wants to stretch. I'd rather stay in my comfort zone and watch Glenn Beck and believe the whole world's a conspiracy than have to actually go, oh, no, this is a human being. And who's to say that my world," he concluded, "is so much better than theirs." For Queer to the Left, along with challenging our heretofore unquestioned valuing of secularism and pigeonholing of Christianity, being in this coalition also encouraged us to move away from political purism. Each group might have rejected the other or attempted to reconcile our irresolvable differences, but neither did. Instead, it was, in performance theorist Jose Munoz's words, a strange kind of crossing, a rather thrilling relational becoming. Coalition provides a space to be and do together and become differently as a result, to sense other possibilities, open toward the unknown, experiment and learn from mistakes, to develop trust and practices of solidarity, and to build new collectivities and new worlds. So when I asked John Trott from the Jesus People what it was like to work with Queer to the Left, he suggested both the strangeness and the thrill of the encounter. "Oh, I loved it," he said. "It was so fun to be able to say, Jesus People USA in their coalition with Queer to the Left, and see people on the gentrifiers' blogs in the area go, yeah, it's stupid, the Jesus People and Queer to the Left? What kind of world is this anyway?" John continued, "It was a pretty cool one, actually. I kind of like that, you know." A comment made by a Courage member, so someone who wasn't in Queer to the Left, wasn't in the Jesus People, but was part of the larger coalition, at a public hearing similarly suggested that this mutual becoming was generating something unexpected, difficult to fathom, and rich with potential. He said, "You know something interesting is happening when these leftist queers and the Jesus People USA are working together." Okay, so I want to make some cautionary notes now. In drawing from this history to consider what a coalition can do, I don't mean to suggest that groups should resolve their differences by sweeping them under the carpet. In fact, the very names of these groups, Jesus People USA, Queer to the Left, precluded anybody hiding or ignoring differences. And in any event, the coalition did not require that kind of burying of differences, and it didn't require resolving them either. Nor am I proposing a kind of fantasy of conflict-free togetherness, as if we all could and should rise above the conflicts that frequently preclude or undo coalitions. Queer to the Left did not somehow get over it. We weren't affronted by the Jesus People's homophobia. I think because they were never explicitly homophobic in our presence. And if they had been, we probably would have challenged them. As part of principled political struggle within a coalition, expressing anger might be especially vital, as Audre Lorde reminds. She says, anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification, for it is in the painful process of this translation that we identify who are our allies with whom we have grave differences and who are our genuine enemies. In this case, there wasn't the need to express anger, so it didn't happen. And I think that we were kind of occupying that space of recognizing grave differences, but not being genuine enemies. Now, nor do I mean to suggest that coalition always and only offers something promising. Touching across difference, as Regan cautions, is dangerous. It requires a willingness to risk something, to take the risk, for example, of moving beyond yourself and being changed. And as well, you may not get what you want or what you need. Encounters always happen in historically specific contexts of often deeply grooved power differentials and can spur fears, resentments, furies, and shame. So encounter always entails risk, and occupying different social positions, we all face different risks. Encounter, though, is also both inevitable and necessary. To live is to encounter a world of other entities, and we urgently need to learn to live with beings who differ from ourselves. There's no recipe for how to converge with divergence and without unity, but I think something that allowed the Jesus people and Queer to the Left to work together was that no one decided in advance who we all were. Remarking that the United States has become an intensely tribal society, sociologist Richard Sennett discusses how when we lack direct experience of others, we fall back on fearful fantasies and think we know what other people are like without actually knowing them. Now, to be sure, we had all encountered one another before, in a sense. The Jesus people had pre-existing ideas about queers, and Queer to the Left had pre-existing ideas about evangelical Christians. But perhaps our coalescing was an instance following philosopher Sarah Ahmed of re-encountering those encounters, where rather than holding one another in place, we left open the question of who everyone was, which allowed leaving open the question of who everyone might become. Philosopher Shane Phelan suggests the necessity of precisely that that openness to process and potentiality. The problem for coalition politics, she says, is not what do we share, but rather what might we share as we develop our identities through the process of coalition. At the start, our identities perhaps contradicted one another, but staying open while being in the room together allowed for the possibility of coming to feel affinity even so. I also think that Uptown, the neighborhood, has a remarkable history of coalition across racial lines that probably also paved the way for this unlikely coming together. And I'm thinking here in particular of what is called the original Rainbow Coalition that formed in 1969 in response really to police brutality that was happening in Chicago at that time. So it was a coalition between the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, who were Puerto Rican independentistas basically, and the Young Patriots organization. Well, the Young Lords started as a street gang and then they became a political organization. And then the Young Patriots organization, which was a group of poor whites who had come from Appalachia who were revolutionaries, and their emblem actually included the Confederate flag. So this is a coalition between the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords Party, and the Young Patriots organization. And there actually are photographs of the Black Panthers and the Young Patriots on stage together at a conference in Oakland, California called the United Front Against Fascism conference from 1969, where they're all standing together and the Young Patriots are wearing jeans jackets with the insignia with the Confederate flag on it. Now, they thought it was revolutionary at that time, and it's a long story, which actually probably makes some more sense here in the South to some degree, even if it also rankles a little bit. They thought it was revolutionary in that minute. They understood themselves as an oppressed nation, the white elite oppressing the poor whites in Appalachia in all kinds of ways. They later changed that. They decided it was counter-revolutionary. They got rid of the insignia. But even so, it was an amazing moment. And the Black Panther who actually helped to form this coalition was Bobby Lee, who just died on Friday. He was kind of an amazing person. And in fact, let me just quote him, since he died last week. He said about the Young Patriots, he said, "I had to run with those cats, break bread with them, hang out at the pool hall. I had to lay down on their couch in their neighborhood. And then I had to invite them into mine." That was how the Rainbow Coalition was built, real slow. So Queer to the Left members may not have known that history of that kind of remarkable coalition, but members of Courage, like Mark Kaplan did, as did John Trott from the Jesus People, who was fascinated by it. And as one of the few racially and economically mixed neighborhoods in Chicago, Uptown really kind of conveys that history. You might feel that history just by walking around in the neighborhood. And recalling Huey Newton's 1970 public letter, which called on the Black Panther Party to unite with women's and gay liberation movements, recalling that letter, a guy from Courage, Mark Kaplan, noted that the neighborhood's openness to queer sexualities also goes back to that period. And he recalls black drag queens passing out the Black Panther Party's newspaper in that neighborhood. So the long legs of Uptown's political history, with its marked commitment to solidarity across difference, I think it reached into Courage's low-cost housing coalition. Okay. I'm almost finished, but one other cautionary note, I don't want to overstate this relationship between the Jesus People and Queer to the Left. We really were at the beginning of being near one another, trying out being in the room together without assuming malice or utter incompatibility, and without coming to quick conclusions about one another, but also without getting to know one another very well. We were engaged in aspects of what philosopher Maria Lagunas calls playful world travel, in the sense that we recognize the coexistence of multiple worlds and we're open to uncertainty and surprise and perhaps self-reconstruction when our different worlds met. But our traveling did not take us to the point where we came to know each other's reality, what it is to be them and what it is to be ourselves in their eyes, in Lagunas' words. As she notes, only when we've traveled to each other's worlds are we fully subjects to each other. So we were not engaged in that sort of deep coalition. Members of the Jesus People and Queer to the Left, we were never in the room only together. There were always other Courage members with us in the room. And drawing again from Donna Haraway, I would suggest that we were strangers only beginning to learn how to play together, involved in something more like accompanying than companioning. But even so, for a short while, we were in proximity to, opening ourselves toward, starting to get to know, placing trust in, learning from, affecting, and making ourselves available to being affected by one another. Strange encounters that take the form of alignment rather than merger, Sarah Ahmed writes, allow activists to remake what it is that we may yet have in common. Okay, I'm going to end with a coda here. Two incidents that occurred after this low-cost housing coalition had largely disbanded are suggestive, I think, of the complex, non-linear afterlives that might follow such encounters across difference. So the coalition ended probably sometime in about 2005 or 2006. And fast forward to 2008, a couple years later, when Fred Phelps and members of his Westboro Baptist Church, people remember them, they were the guys, the God Hates Fags folks, and they came to Chicago with their God Hates Fags signs to protest President-elect Obama. And there was one lone counter-protester who showed up to challenge them, and that was John Trott from the Jesus People USA with a sign saying gay people are our neighbors. Okay, now the second incident occurred a few years later when I interviewed John and I asked him about homosexuality. And he said, "It isn't God's ideal for you," he said to me, and continued, "I believe that if you pursued Jesus far enough, you would discover yourself being called into places you've never been, maybe, which might actually be a journey out of homosexuality." So John's comment here, I think, reiterates that this is not a story of unity or of navigating conflict by denying difference. And it reminds us well that the outcome of touching across difference is open. Both groups wanted to go places we had never been, and that was part of what allowed this coalition to exist. For members of Queer to the Left, that was not a journey out toward Jesus or out of homosexuality, and John and I both smiled when he said that to me. But we were drawn, I think, to a space where we could do political activism in a manner that refused political purism and tribalism and enabled world building with unlike others where the outcome was not foreordained. So my curiosity is about the capacities of coalitions, what they can allow to happen, the promise and potentiality of becoming coalitional. Ernst Bloch writes that the not yet is not known in advance, and it surprises us when it arrives. He offers a non-teleological left politic that refreshingly proposes no blueprint or roadmap, but instead leaves an openness to the question of what is to be done. Precisely because the future is undecided and open, we can and need to try stuff out, pulling from the not yet of the past and present in the interests of moving forward. Thank you.
Feminists, anti-pornography, radical feminists, in this bizarre, horrifying alliance with the right-wing evangelical Republican Christians.
Right.
And I always kind of, I guess my take-home point from that, which I think is wrong according to your talk, is like, you got to be careful who you get in bed with, because it will mark you forever. That feminist group can no longer be credible in my eyes because of their coalition partners.
Yeah.
That's not really a question.
Yeah, so you know who wrote it? No, I mean, I think you...
Yeah, I'm not.
No, I mean, I don't think that I want to make this argument such that get in bed with anybody. I don't think so. But so Nancy Whittier, who teaches at Smith in the sociology department, wrote a piece called Frenemies, that is about that thing. And I don't know if she calls it a coalition or not, because they didn't meet together. They didn't. It was more that their problematic politics were aligned, and so there were all kinds of things about the Jesus people that made it understandable why Queer to the Left would be in the room with them. They weren't the right-wing evangelicals who were, in bed with the capitalists. These were the kind of Jesus freaks who were really into fighting poverty. So, but the typical way of understanding that would be to say, well, that's why they got together. People put their differences on hold. They bracket those differences for the larger good. And that's a kind of rationalist, pragmatic understanding of that sort of a coming together. And while I think that that's true to some degree, I wanted to think through what else a coalition offers that gets occluded by that kind of a rationalist account. But anyway, so no, you don't get into bed with the...
I mean, do you think Andrea Dworkin is having coffee with Newt Gingrich talking about the good old days? Or?
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I think that there were too many... I think that the radical feminists, it was too bad that their arguments lended themselves to a right-wing attack on women and queers. And that was unfortunate, but I don't know. I would be curious how they feel about that. What did they think about the fact that the right wing was using it? And I bet they talk about it somewhere, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Yes.
It's interesting that when you present the process that's taking place for the queers and for the Christians, I heard you sort of equating the process of openness as if they were equal, or on the same power plane, when in reality they're not, because the sort of fierce heteronormativity is a form of oppression over a queer identified lifestyle. So I understand that maybe there is a, in the act of being queer and equating my process of openness with people that have power over me, I am accessing power by equating them as being on the same playing field when they are not, if I'm being clear. You know what I'm saying? Like, if I'm saying that, like, there's no difference between me being accepting of an evangelical with an evangelical being accepting of queer me, I am gaining power through equating these processes that are actually hierarchical. I wonder about the self-abnegation in the sort of losing of the hierarchy, and I also wonder if other privileges have to be in place for that to occur. As in, queer to the left people have to have certain privileges that are fueling them to allow them to self-abnegate, to sort of like confront other privileges that they hold. Whereas if you're talking about other people who don't have race privilege, who don't have class privilege, that's self-abnegation, and equating their process with evangelicals may have had a very different result. That is actually a question, even if it doesn't sound like it. Would it have had do you have to have certain social privileges to be able to undergo that process? What about the self-abnegation?
Well, okay, so I think that you have to look at the historically specific conditions in which something like this happens. So I don't know that I would be able to take this and plop it someplace else, precisely because of the ways in which power operates differently in different contexts. So I'm not sure that I would say, take this and plop it here to make sense of something else, or to try out something else. But in response to the part of your question, which is about, the queers were not self-abnegating. I mean, they just were queer. They were queer as could be. And the Christians were not self-abnegating, but I know you're not asking about them on that level, but they weren't either. They prayed and did whatever they wanted to do. And so there's something interesting about kind of, and I don't know what I think about this, but there's something interesting about not caring. And I actually think that some of this, a lot of the people who were involved in Queer to the Left came out of the AIDS movement. And so that was a moment when suddenly the emergence of queer happens, which is very in your face, very anti-normative, very angry, and recognizing that mainstream straight society wasn't going to recognize queers, so queers began to recognize themselves and said, we don't need that. We will demand what we need in terms of resources and stuff like that, but their recognition of queers, forget it. They would rather we were dead, you know. And so there was a kind of defiant, like, who cares what they think? If they're homophobes, that's their problem, not our problem, except when it is. And I don't know that that would work the same way around race. I don't think it would, which I think is what your example is, you know, where you're asking the question in a sense. But there's something interesting about that. Like there's certain activist groups that I think are kind of saying, you know, we're not really thinking about you and your hang-ups. We're just demanding what we need, you know. So yeah. Yes.
So I loved your talk. This is fascinating. I lived in Edgewater in the mid-1980s, so I knew folks who used People USA, so this is a trip. Coming out of religious studies, one of the other things that's happening in evangelical Christianity at this moment are strategies of proselytizing.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, was there any sense of a dynamic of, we're going to go be with this people and living the lifestyle of Jesus, it's going to convert them?
Yeah, I think that they may have thought let's be in the room with them and maybe we will convert them. And I think John saying to me years later in our interview, I think that there's a route out of homosexuality towards Jesus for you, you know. And I just looked at him, and in fact I said to him, I said, oh, John,
Yeah.
do you really think that? And he said, well, I'm just, you know.
I gotta say it.
Yeah, I gotta say it, right? It's part of what I'm supposed to do. I don't know. I think that there may have been that for them, why they would be in this was the possibility of that. There was no proselytizing that ever went on, though. There was no kind of, here, come to our meeting, or here, let me give you some literature, or anything like that. Yeah. But I think in that period, I think the Jesus people is kind of one of the, I mean, they're so on the fringes of evangelical Christianity, but I think that they are the leading edge, in a sense, of evangelicals trying to move away from some of that hard right evangelical stuff. So, yeah. But the proselytizing, they didn't do it. I wouldn't be surprised if they were thinking maybe we could get some. Yeah. 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 Which would have been then a more kind of pragmatic reason for them to do it, yeah, to be in the coalition. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts or concerns?
Describe the earlier question about coalitions versus whatever we want to call.
The religious, yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, would it be more descriptive to say something about that's more like interest politics, where people are just aligning behind a policy that they want versus, you know, I don't know if I want to call that a coalition in this sense that you're trying to theorize, right, with all the beautiful things that you're pointing out, like a real coalition would do. So I don't know, do we want to find a different word?
Yeah, well, that was like in that case, frenemies maybe is the word,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
Although I don't even know if it is, because I don't think that they were friends even, you know. I mean, frenemies is a word that came up after. I don't really know exactly what that word means, but yeah, I don't.
Like those coalitions don't exist now too, right? So the kind of carceral feminism stuff that Elizabeth Bernstein's talking about around sex trafficking, right? So that those kinds of feminists who are interested in using the state to put people in jail around trafficking have coalition. Well, I don't want to call them that, but they have frenemies.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the right that are religious, right? That are religiously active on this issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think I would use the word coalition unless they're actually plotting together.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's something complex going on in there that I think those groups have to contend with. Like that feels like a friction that is hard to contend with. And so I'm most interested in how those different feminists are trying to make sense of how their politics are being used.